I had always considered myself a loyal friend, someone who would never do anything to betray a close bond. My friendship with David had lasted for years, built on a foundation of mutual respect, trust, and shared experiences. We'd been through thick and thin together, and I had always admired how he treated his wife, Emma. They were a happy couple, David, the strong and reliable husband, and Emma, the kind and graceful wife. Their marriage seemed solid and unshakable, and I never once questioned their connection. But things began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. It started one evening when I found myself at their house for dinner. David had been called away on business, leaving Emma and me alone for the evening. It wasn't uncommon for me to spend time with her when David was away. He was often busy with work, and we had become friends in our own right over the years. But that evening felt different. We were sitting in the kitchen, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about everything and nothing. Emma had always been easy to talk to. She had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room, like she genuinely cared about what you had to say. And that evening I opened up more than usual, telling her things I hadn't even shared with David. She listened, nodding along, her gaze soft and understanding. There was something comforting about her presence, but also something electric. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but I felt a stirring deep inside, something I hadn't felt before. The air between us seemed charged, the space growing smaller with each word we exchanged. When I mentioned that I had been struggling with some personal issues, Emma offered to help, her voice soft and gentle. "You know you can talk to me, right?" she said, her eyes locking with mine in a way that made my heart race. "I'm here for you." I nodded, grateful for her support, but something lingered in the back of my mind. A small voice, barely a whisper, told me this wasn't just a friendly conversation anymore. It was more. But I pushed it aside, focusing on the words she was saying, trying to ignore the way her presence was making my pulse quicken. As the evening wore on, the wine loosened our tongues, and the conversation shifted to more personal territory. She spoke about David, about their relationship, and how she sometimes felt distant from him with his long hours at work. There was a vulnerability in her voice, something I hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just David's wife, she was a woman with her struggles and her desires. I knew I shouldn't have let the conversation continue in that direction. It was dangerous. But the more she spoke, the more I found myself drawn to her, to the way she expressed herself, to the way she looked at me with those deep, searching eyes. It was as if she was laying herself bare, showing me a side of her I hadn't seen before, and I couldn't help but feel a deep, inexplicable connection. Later, as the evening wound down and the night grew late, I found myself standing by the door, ready to leave. We exchanged a brief hug, the kind that was normal between us, no different from any other time. But this time, it felt different. Her touch lingered longer than usual, her hands warm on my back. And when she pulled away, her eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw something in them, something unreadable but undeniable. I quickly turned away, excusing myself with a muttered good night, and rushed out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just overthinking things. Emma was married, and David was my best friend. There was no room for anything else. But as I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that I had crossed an invisible line, and there was no turning back. The days that followed that night were strange. Every time I saw Emma, there was an unspoken tension between us. I tried to act normal around her, but it was impossible. My mind kept replaying that hug, her touch lingering for just a second longer than it should have. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that it was nothing more than a friendly gesture. After all, she was married to my best friend, and I had no business thinking about her in any other way. But then, one afternoon, I found myself at their house again. David was out for a few hours, working on a project, and Emma invited me to stay for lunch. I knew it was harmless, a simple meal between friends. But as I walked into the kitchen, I could feel the weight of the unspoken words between us. Emma was humming softly to herself, chopping vegetables, her movements graceful as ever. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Hey, glad you could make it," she said, her voice light but with an undertone I couldn't quite place. I smiled back, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. Of course, I was in the neighborhood. She laughed, a sound that made my chest tighten. I watched her as she moved around the kitchen, feeling that familiar pull toward her again. Something about the way she moved, the way she carried herself, was magnetic. My pulse quickened as she came closer, passing me a plate of food. "I made your favorite," she said, her eyes meeting mine again with that same intensity. There it was again, the spark. I sat down at the table, trying to act casual, but the tension was thick in the air. We ate in silence at first, but then Emma started talking about David again, about how he had been distant lately, how his mind seemed preoccupied with work. Her words seemed to carry a deeper meaning, a hint of loneliness that I hadn't noticed before. I wanted to tell her to stop, to remind her that I was her friend and that we were crossing dangerous ground. But instead, I found myself listening, drawn in by her words, by the vulnerability she was revealing. And before I knew it, I was sharing my own feelings, my own struggles with her, things I had never even shared with David. It was easy. Talking to Emma felt like breathing. She had this way of making me feel understood and seen in a way no one else had. There was something comforting about her presence, but also something intoxicating. After lunch, we moved to the living room, sitting on the couch. I kept my distance, though I could feel the tension growing between us, thickening the air with every passing second. Emma was sitting just a little too close, her leg brushing against mine. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising in my face. I wanted to pull away, to escape the situation, but I couldn't. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind, she did something unexpected. She leaned in slightly, her eyes locking with mine. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The space between us closed, and without thinking, I leaned forward too. It wasn't planned. It wasn't deliberate. But it happened. Her lips brushed against mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, but full of electricity. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, to remember what I was doing. But my body didn't listen. I kissed her back, just for a moment, as if this had been inevitable all along. When we finally pulled away, neither of us said anything. The silence was deafening. I couldn't look at her, and I could tell she couldn't look at me either. We both knew what had just happened, and neither of us was ready to face the consequences. I shouldn't have done that," Emma whispered, her voice shaky. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the conflict written all over her face. I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. I know, neither should I. But even as I said the words, a part of me didn't want to stop. I didn't want to face the truth that I had just crossed a line I should not have crossed. And from the look in Emma's eyes, I knew she felt the same way. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to say next. I wanted to run, to leave, to pretend it had never happened. But I couldn't. The connection between us was undeniable, and the more I tried to resist it, the stronger it seemed to grow. That kiss changed everything. It was no longer just a friendship between Emma and me. It had become something dangerous, something neither of us could ignore. We avoided each other for a few days after that, unable to face the reality of what had happened. I kept telling myself I could walk away, that I could pretend nothing had changed. But every time I saw her, every time our eyes met, I felt that same pull, that same electric charge between us. One evening, I found myself at their house again, though this time David wasn't supposed to be home for a few hours. Emma invited me over, saying she needed someone to talk to. I knew I shouldn't go. I knew that the temptation to cross that line again would be too great. But I went anyway. When I arrived, Emma greeted me at the door with a hesitant smile. She looked beautiful, as always, but there was something different about her tonight, something that made my heart race. Her eyes were darker than usual, more intense. She didn't say much at first, just led me to the living room where we sat together on the couch, the space between us closer than it had ever been. We talked for a while, but it felt like we were dancing around the truth. We both knew what was happening, but neither of us was ready to acknowledge it. The tension between us was unbearable, thickening the air with every passing second. And then, without warning, Emma reached out and placed her hand on mine. The touch was soft and hesitant, but it sent a wave of heat rushing through me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look at her. She was so close now, her breath warm against my skin. And before I could stop myself, I kissed her again. This time there was no hesitation, no guilt, just pure, unfiltered desire. Her lips parted, welcoming me, and I felt the flood of emotions hit me all at once: guilt, excitement, fear, passion. We were both consumed by the kiss, and it felt like the world outside didn't matter. Nothing existed except for the two of us, locked in this dangerous moment of intimacy. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathless, our hearts pounding in our chests. Emma's eyes were wide, her face flushed. She didn't speak at first, but I could feel her body trembling beside me. I wasn't sure what to say either. I knew we had crossed a line we could never uncross, and I wasn't sure if I regretted it or if I wanted to stop. "I don't know if we should be doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is wrong. I'm married." "I know," I replied, my voice thick with emotion, "but I don't think I can stop." The days after that kiss felt like a blur. My mind was constantly preoccupied with Emma, replaying the intensity of that moment over and over. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face and felt the softness of her lips. It was like a drug, and I couldn't stop myself from craving more. But I knew the consequences of our actions. This was a dangerous game, one that could destroy everything: my friendship with David, the trust they shared, and the life we had all built together. Yet, despite the consequences, I found myself thinking about her constantly, longing for the next encounter. And it didn't take long for Emma and me to meet again this time, with no words about what had happened before. We both knew it couldn't be ignored, but neither of us dared to acknowledge the depth of our involvement. The next time I saw her, I arrived at her house under the pretense of helping her with something trivial. She greeted me with a smile, but there was something more in her eyes, something deeper than friendship. Her gaze lingered on me longer than usual, and I could feel the unspoken tension between us, thick and undeniable. We sat in the living room, and once again we fell into a comfortable silence, one that seemed to echo with the weight of our secret. Emma looked at me, her expression conflicted, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and took her hand. This time, there was no hesitation. The chemistry between us was palpable, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. "I know this is wrong," Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "but I can't stop thinking about you." My heart skipped a beat. I had never expected her to say those words aloud. "Neither can I," I admitted, my voice low. It was as if the floodgates had opened. We were both trapped in this whirlwind of emotions, too far gone to turn back. I leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation as we kissed again, this time with more urgency and more passion. It wasn't just a kiss anymore, it was the beginning of something we both knew was dangerous but couldn't resist. We spent the next few hours together, locked in a world of our own, unable to break free from the pull of our attraction. Our touch became more intimate, more desperate, as if we were trying to make up for lost time. The secrecy of it all only seemed to intensify the desire, each stolen moment feeling more forbidden than the last. We knew we were crossing a line, but it didn't matter. The affair had begun, and we were both consumed by it. The affair continued in secret for weeks. Each meeting was like a thrill, a forbidden escape from the reality of our lives. We met in hidden places, quiet restaurants, empty parks, and secluded corners of the city, where no one could see us. The excitement of sneaking around, of stealing moments with her, felt like a dangerous game we were playing, and I couldn't get enough of it. But of course, nothing could stay hidden forever. The guilt and fear were always lurking in the back of my mind, but I couldn't stop myself. Emma and I had become too entangled, too connected in a way that couldn't be explained. We couldn't pull away from each other. David started noticing the small things. The late nights I spent at their house, the lingering glances between me and Emma, the way our conversations seemed to shift whenever he was around. He was smart, and it didn't take long for him to sense that something was off. He began asking questions, subtle at first, then more pointed. "Is everything okay with you?" and Emma, David asked one evening, his tone casual but with an edge that made my stomach churn. I had been caught in a lie. I didn't know how to respond. My mind raced, and my pulse quickened. I wanted to deny it, to tell him everything was fine, that he was imagining things, but the truth was I couldn't. It was impossible to keep up the charade any longer. I couldn't lie to him any more than I already had. "She's been a little distant lately," I muttered, trying to brush it off, "but it's nothing serious. She's probably just stressed." David seemed to buy it, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The tension between us had shifted, and I knew he was watching me more closely now. I just didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending. How much longer could I hide the truth? But the inevitable moment came one evening when everything came crashing down. I had stayed at Emma's place for too long, lingering in her presence, caught in the thrill of our secret. As I was leaving, I ran into David in the driveway. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice tight with something I couldn't quite place. I froze. The weight of the question hung heavy between us, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes: suspicion, hurt, maybe even fear. "I was just helping Emma with some things," I replied, my voice steady, but inside I was trembling. David didn't say anything at first, but I could see the gears turning in his head. And then, without warning, he asked, "Have you two been?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusing. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I knew I couldn't lie anymore. I couldn't hide it. The truth was out. I didn't mean for it to happen," I stammered, my words feeling like a cowardly attempt to justify my actions. David's face turned pale. His eyes, once full of trust, were now filled with betrayal and anger. "You've been seeing my wife behind my back," he whispered, his voice shaking with disbelief. The weight of his words hit me like a slap to the face. I had betrayed him, the one person who had trusted me with everything. The guilt and shame overwhelmed me, and I could barely look him in the eye. He turned away, his face hardening, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. "Don't bother coming back here," David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Just leave." And with that, I was no longer welcome in their home. The friendship we had spent years building was shattered in an instant, and I was left standing there, alone with the consequences of my actions. In the days that followed, I was consumed with guilt. I had lost everything: my best friend, my self-respect, and the trust that had once been the foundation of my relationship with both Emma and David. There was no way to undo the damage. My betrayal had not only destroyed David's faith in me, but had also torn apart their marriage. Emma, too, seemed to be drifting away. We hadn't spoken much since the confrontation, and when we did, it was always awkward, the tension thick between us. The affair, once full of excitement and passion, had now become a burden. The reality of what we had done weighed heavily on both of us. I tried to reach out to David, but he wouldn't answer my calls. I tried to apologize to Emma, but it was clear that the damage had been done. The affair was over, and the guilt of what we had done would stay with me forever. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized the true cost of my actions. I had lost everything that mattered. I had ruined the bond of trust I had with David, and I had hurt Emma in ways I couldn't fix. The affair had been a fleeting moment of passion, but the consequences would last a lifetime. As I looked out the window, I thought about what I had thrown away, and I knew that I could never go back to the way things were before. The damage was done, and there was no escaping the truth. The affair was over, but the consequences of my choices would follow me forever.